Hello again. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to generate a displacement map. The first thing we'll want to do is open up the Lesson 4 3ds Max file provided. In this file, we'll see the high and low poly models that we'll be working with. Since this isn't a modeling tutorial, we won't be going into any kind of detail about how these models were constructed. However, it should be noted at this stage that the low poly model should already be unwrapped and have no overlapping faces, so it can be used to generate our displacement map. So if we select our low poly, go to the modifier drop down and select unwrap UVW, then hit open UV editor, we can see that our model has in fact been unwrapped. Let's go ahead and close that. Collapse the stack by right clicking and hit collapse all. Hit yes for the pop-up and we can begin to export these models into Mudbox. We'll start with the high poly model, and the first thing we want to do is make sure that it's centered to the scene. We can check this by first selecting the model, making sure that we have the select and move button up here selected. If we don't, we can simply click the button or hit W on our keyboard. Looking down here, we can see the world coordinates, and in this case they have already been centered. So we can go ahead and export it by coming up here, clicking on the 3ds Max icon, going down to the export option, clicking the little arrow on the side, selecting export selected. Now make sure we click the arrow and not export, because if we select export, what 3ds Max will do is export everything in our scene, which is not what we want at all. Having clicked on export selected, we will get this pop-up asking us where we want to store the model. I'm going to be saving to the desktop, but feel free to save wherever you would like. Let's go down and change the file type to OBJ, and we'll rename this lesson 04 underscore shield underscore HP for high poly. With this done, we can go ahead and hit save. Now we'll get this second window popping up asking us what settings we would like. What we'll want to do is go down to the preset drop down and select Mudbox. This will give us the settings we need. I also like to have the normals option ticked. What this will do is save our model's normal information and spares Mudbox the trouble of having to recalculate them when we import it. Now we can go ahead and click export. With that done, we can now do the same for the low poly. Let's click on the model, again making sure that we have the select and move button selected, and center it in our scene. We can do this by right clicking the little arrows beside our world coordinates, and 3ds Max will snap the model to the center. It's important to make sure that our high and low poly models are both centered, so that when we bring them into Mudbox, they are perfectly overlapping, which is required for us to successfully generate our displacement map. Next, we can go up to the 3ds Max icon again, go down to export, click the little arrow and select export selected. Make sure the file type is OBJ and we'll name it lesson 4 underscore shield underscore low or LP for low poly, and click save. This time, when the settings menu comes up, 3ds Max will have remembered our settings from last time, so we can go ahead and just click on export. Right, now we're ready to get set up in Mudbox, so let's open it up with an empty scene. To import our models, we simply click on File up here in the left hand corner, go down to Import, navigate to our files, which in my case is on the desktop, select the one we want and hit open. I'm going to do the high poly model first. Now, Mudbox will pop up with this warning saying that it's detected some problems with our mesh. These UVW ones down here we can just ignore because we're not going to be using the UVW coordinates for our high poly. This high valence vertex one means that we have a single vertex that has many edges connected to it. This might be an issue, but let's just hit keep all for now and see if it is. You might get an additional pop-up saying that you have imported a high poly model into Mudbox with no subdivision levels. This isn't really important and can just be ignored. With the high poly model now in Mudbox, we can zoom in to this red dot, which is the high valence vertex that Mudbox warned us about. We can see that there aren't any visible issues with this, which for our high poly is all we really care about. So we can safely ignore that. Now let's hide our high poly model by going to the object list and clicking this little dot next to our high poly. Now we want to bring in our low poly by again going up to File, down to Import, selecting our low poly and hitting Open. We'll get the high valence vertex warning again, but for now we can just hit Keep All. Finally, we've got both of our models in Mudbox ready to generate our displacement map. But what's the next step? Well, we'll need to set up our extraction operation. How we do that is to go up here to the UVs and Maps dropdown, select Extract Texture Maps, and click New Operation. This will bring up a new window with a few different options for what kind of map we want to generate. Let's go ahead and tick the displacement and normal maps. We'll see that this increases the size of the window and we'll be presented with a range of different settings. I'm just going to move this up a little bit so we can see the whole thing. Let's pop back to the displacement map settings, and the first thing we want to do is input our low poly model into the target models box. So we click Add All and simply remove the high poly model. Next, we need to untick the Smooth Target Models option. What this does is smooth out our low poly model before Mudbox calculates the map that we've selected. We'll talk about why we may want to do this later, but for now, it is unhelpful. Next is the Use Creases and Hard Edges option. This we won't go into detail about, but we'll want to leave ticked. Now let's input our high poly model into the Source Models box. So hit Add All and select and remove the low poly. The Smooth Surface Models option we'll always want to leave unticked, as we should have all the smoothness required of our high poly already built in. Next, in the Method dropdown, we want to select Ray Casting. Subdivision should only be used if we're generating a map using the different subdivision levels of a single model created in Mudbox. In the Chosen Samples dropdown, we'll want to stick with Furthest Outside. To put it very simply, this option concerns how we want Mudbox to interpolate the detail in our high poly based on its positioning with regards to the low poly. For more information on what the different options do, we can hover over the Chosen Samples dropdown and a pop-up will appear. However, for our needs, Furthest Outside is best. Moving on, the search distance refers to how far from the low poly in both directions Mudbox will check for details to bake into the chosen map. The nice thing about Mudbox is it gives us this best guess button. For the sake of demonstration, if we change this number, then hit best guess, it will set it to what Mudbox estimates is the furthest search distance that we'll need. This is extremely useful for us, as we would otherwise have to find the right search distance through trial and error. The next option we're presented with is the Test Both Sides checkbox. What this does, when checked, is allow Mudbox to register high poly objects that, for whatever reason, have inverted normals. However, for our purposes, we can leave this unchecked. Now we can move on to the Image Properties options. This first one will not apply to us because we have one target model, and we can therefore use either of the two options provided. Next, we have image size and anti-aliasing. I'm going to stick with the default settings to minimize the render time for the sake of this tutorial, but feel free to set this how you would like. The next setting is the Normalize to Search Distance checkbox, and what this will do, if checked, is use the maximum search distance as the displacement value that is represented by true white and true black in our displacement map, and extrapolate the rest of the color intensities based on that. If unchecked, Mudbox will simply use the largest distance it finds between the target and source models to use for true white and true black. Now, if the best guess button was used previously, then the difference between these two settings will be negligible anyway, so let's just go ahead and leave this checked. The last section we have is our output options. The first drop-down is our map type, and we're going to leave this set to texture, as ptex is not a widely supported format as of yet. The next one is the file name and saving path, so let's click on this box to open up the save window. Again, I'm going to be using the desktop. Let's leave the file type as PNG, and we'll name it lesson 4 underscore shield underscore DM for displacement map, and hit save. The bits per channel we can leave as 8-bit for the purposes of this project, but I would recommend turning this up if you have any areas on your high poly model which are particularly far away from your low poly. It'll give you more available color intensities in the displacement map, and will therefore provide smoother surfaces over longer displacement distances. However, using a bit depth of over 16 will require you to use either the TIFF or OpenEXR file formats. This last tick box will apply our displacement map after being generated as a bump map on our low poly model, so we can view it straight away. We'll leave that ticked because it can be useful in determining if our maps have generated properly without having to load them into a separate piece of software. With all that done, we can move on to our normal map options. Now we'll notice that Mudbox has retained the settings that we have just put in for the sections that are used by both displacement and normal maps. So we can leave most of these as they are and go straight down to the normal map output settings. Coincidentally, we also want to leave these as they are because they happen to be the settings that our rendering software, Marmoset Toolbag 2, uses. However, if you're using other viewing software, you're going to want to check first to see what settings it'll want you to use. Right, we can go down to the output options now, leaving the map type on texture again. Let's click to bring up the save window. The directory we used before will automatically open, so let's set the format to PNG again and name the file lesson 4 underscore shield underscore normal and hit save. For normal maps, we're never going to need to use more than an 8-bit image, so let's leave that as it is. And we'll also need to leave the preview checkbox ticked. Finally, we've input all of our settings, and now we can hit extract. To save time, I'm going to pause the video while it extracts and we'll pick up again once Mudbox has finished. Okay, so Mudbox has finished extracting and as we can see has now applied the maps to our low poly. So in this lesson we've learned how to generate a displacement map using Mudbox. In the next lesson we'll walk through setting up everything in Marmoset Toolbag 2.